The crowd roared like a storm breaking over the arena, an electrified sea of voices surging with each breath of action inside the ring. Sweat and blood painted the canvas in streaks of battle-worn grit, a testament to the war waged between two warriors. Under the unforgiving glare of the overhead lights, Shakur Stevenson stood in his corner, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his gaze locked onto the man across from him. Josh Padley, a fighter with an iron will and an even harder chin, leaned against the ropes, his arms hanging low, his breath shallow but determined. The referee watched them both with the sharp scrutiny of a man standing at the edge of a decision that would either define or destroy. For 9 relentless rounds, Stevenson had dissected Padley with the precision of a surgeon, his punches sharp, strategic, and calculated. But Padley had taken them all, answering back with sheer stubbornness, the kind of heart that makes legends or leaves them broken on the canvas. The fight had reached that crucial moment, the space between heroism and surrender, where a single decision could mean everything. The crowd sensed it, an almost primal awareness that something was about to happen. The air pulsed with it, thick with expectation. Then, before the 10th round could begin, before the bell could signal another 3 minutes of punishment, the referee raised his arms and waved it off. The fight was over. A ripple of shock swept through the arena. Boos mixed with cheers, voices clashed in heated debate, but none were louder than the outrage in Padley's corner. His team erupted in protest, fists pounding the apron, their voices swallowed by the chaos of disbelief. Padley himself, battered but standing, shook his head furiously, his face contorted in frustration. He hadn't gone down. He hadn't quit. And yet, victory had been taken from him before he could throw his next punch. Across the ring, Stevenson barely reacted. His face remained unreadable, his emotions buried beneath the mask of a fighter who had done what needed to be done. The night was his, but the way it had ended left a lingering bitterness in the air. Backstage, beyond the frenzy of cameras and flashing lights, Teofimo Lopez sat watching it all unfold on a screen, his arms folded tightly across his chest. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, but his eyes burned with an intensity that spoke of something deeper than amusement. A former undisputed lightweight champion, a man who had been both celebrated and doubted, he knew exactly what it felt like to be in that ring, to stand in that space between triumph and controversy. And now, as the world erupted into heated debates over the stoppage, all eyes would eventually turn to the fighters who had walked those same paths before. A reporter, eager to capitalize on the moment, approached him with a microphone in hand. "Teo, you just saw what happened out there. What's your honest take on Shakur stopping Padley after 9? The question lingered, its weight heavy with the expectations of an answer that could shake the conversation even further. Lopez exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable, as if measuring the words before they left his lips. Then, finally, he leaned forward, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of experience. "Look," he said, locking eyes with the camera, "I know what it's like to be in those deep waters, to push past that breaking point when everyone else thinks you're done. And I know what it's like to have a fight taken out of your hands. That stoppage? That wasn't just about the fighters in that ring. That was about control. About power. And if you think that's the last we'll hear of this, you're dead wrong." The room fell silent for a beat, the tension stretching as those words hung in the air. The fight was over, but the war had just begun. The moment Teofimo Lopez spoke, the energy in the room shifted. The reporters, the crew members, the lingering fight officials, all of them paused, drawn into the weight of his words like moths to a flickering flame. The cameras, already rolling, zoomed in just a little tighter, hungry for more. It wasn't just what Lopez had said, it was how he had said it, with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen the game from both sides inside the ring, where fists and strategy dictated destiny, and outside it, where politics and power often stole the final say. He leaned back in his chair, arms still folded, his expression unshaken by the storm he had just set in motion. But beneath that composed exterior, something burned. Across the hall, Shakur Stevenson stood under the harsh glow of the locker room lights, the weight of victory pressing down on him like an invisible force. His team buzzed around him, voices overlapping, half celebrating, half defending. A win was a win, but this one came with an asterisk, and everyone in the room knew it. Stevenson unwrapped his hands slowly, staring at the tape as if searching for answers in the creases. He had fought the perfect fight, had controlled every second of it, had broken Padley down piece by piece until there was nothing left but the inevitable. And yet, the conversation wasn't about his dominance, it was about the stoppage, about whether the referee had robbed Padley of something greater than just the closing rounds. His jaw clenched, frustration simmering beneath the surface. He had done what he was supposed to do. Why did it feel like he had lost something in the process? Down the hall, Josh Padley sat on the examination table, his knuckles raw, his ribs aching, but his anger eclipsing every physical pain. His coach paced in front of him, hands on his hips, still fuming over what had happened. "You had him," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "You weren't out. You weren't done." Padley remained silent, staring down at his bruised hands. The truth was he had been hurt. Stevenson had gotten the better of him, had picked him apart with precision that made every mistake feel like a death sentence. But he had never stopped believing he could turn it around. There was always that chance, one punch, one moment that could change everything. That was the unwritten law of boxing, the heartbeat of the sport itself. And yet, the decision had been made for him, as if he were a passenger in his own fate. He exhaled slowly, his chest tight with resentment. This wasn't over. Meanwhile, the world outside the arena was already ablaze with speculation. Social media had erupted in a frenzy of divided opinions, fans and analysts dissecting every angle, every slow-motion replay, searching for the defining truth. Was the stoppage justified? Had the referee acted in the interest of safety, or had he stolen something from the fight, from the fans, from the very essence of what made boxing beautiful and brutal? The debate raged on, fueled by emotions, by allegiances, by the endless hunger for controversy. And in the midst of it all, one name kept surfacing: Teofimo Lopez. His words had struck a nerve, had ignited a conversation that was quickly spiraling into something bigger than the fight itself. Later that night, as the echoes of the event still lingered in the air, Lopez found himself alone in a quiet corner of the arena, his phone vibrating with notifications. Texts, calls, messages from people he hadn't spoken to in months. Some agreed with him. Some warned him to be careful. But all of them understood one thing: his words had power. And power, in this sport, was a dangerous thing. He looked up, his thoughts heavy, knowing that the storm he had stepped into was just beginning. Somewhere in the city, Stevenson was still trying to drown out the noise, Padley was still seething with unfinished business, and the world was still waiting for someone to tip the balance. One fight had ended, but the real battle was only just starting. As the dust from the fight settled, the chaos surrounding the stoppage only grew louder. The headlines stretched across every platform, dissecting every second of that ninth round with an obsessive scrutiny that bordered on madness. Pundits clashed on live television, their voices rising in heated debates about fighter safety, referee decisions, and the thin line between protecting a boxer and robbing him of his defining moment. The sport had seen controversial stoppages before, but this one felt different, as if it carried a weight beyond just a single fight. The debate had turned into something bigger, a battle for control, for narrative, for legacy. And at the center of it all, three fighters stood at a crossroads, each one affected in ways they hadn't yet fully grasped. Shakur Stevenson had barely left the arena when his phone started vibrating nonstop. Calls from his team, texts from reporters fishing for a reaction, social media notifications flooding his screen like a relentless wave. He ignored most of it, knowing that no matter what he said, it wouldn't be enough. If he defended the stoppage, they'd call him soft. If he criticized it, they'd say he was discrediting his own victory. There was no winning outside the ring, not in moments like these. And yet one name kept appearing in the noise, a voice that had somehow made itself louder than the rest: Teofimo Lopez. He had heard the clip, had seen the way Lopez spoke with a conviction that made it sound less like an opinion and more like a warning. Something about it didn't sit right. He respected Lopez's skills, understood the fire that burned inside him, but there was an edge to his words that hinted at something deeper. A fighter didn't speak like that unless they knew more than they were letting on. Josh Padley, on the other hand, was done talking. He had spent the entire night pacing, reliving the fight in his mind, feeling every shot, every moment where he could have done something differently. The bitter taste of an unfinished war sat heavy in his chest, and no amount of justifications could change that. He wanted to move on, to find the next fight, but there was a problem: no one wanted to let this moment go. He was being bombarded with interview requests, offers to sit on podcasts, invitations to tell his side of the story. And the more he listened, the more it became clear that people didn't just see him as a fighter anymore. They saw him as a symbol, a man caught in a system bigger than himself. The stoppage wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the sport itself. And that kind of attention was dangerous. But what neither Stevenson nor Padley knew was that there was more to this fight than met the eye. Somewhere in the depths of the boxing world, beneath the surface of what the public saw, there were whispers. Deals made behind closed doors, decisions influenced by unseen hands. And as Lopez sat in his hotel room, watching the coverage unfold, he saw the signs that most people missed. He had been in this sport long enough to know when something didn't add up. The timing of the stoppage, the immediate reaction, the way certain voices were louder than others, it all felt orchestrated. And if there was one thing he had learned in boxing, it was that nothing happened by accident. He exhaled slowly, staring at his phone, his mind racing. There was something going on, something bigger than just a controversial ending to a fight. And if he was right, if his instincts were telling him the truth, then this wasn't just about Stevenson and Padley anymore. It was about something far more dangerous. The next morning, while the world was still arguing over what had happened, Lopez received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated before answering, his gut tightening as he brought the phone to his ear. A voice on the other end spoke quickly, the tone sharp and direct. "You're asking too many questions," the voice said, low and almost mechanical, as if the person on the other end knew they had to keep this brief. Lopez's heartbeat quickened. He didn't recognize the voice, but he knew exactly what this meant. Someone had noticed. Someone wanted him to stop before he got too close. But instead of fear, something else sparked inside him: curiosity. He had been right. There was something bigger at play. And now, he was in the middle of it. He hung up, his jaw tightening as he sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the call settling in. He had a choice to make. He could step back, let the story play out as it was being written, or he could keep pushing, keep pulling at the threads until he uncovered the truth. But deep down, he already knew what he was going to do. A fighter never backs down from a challenge. And whatever this was, it had just become a fight of its own. Teofimo Lopez sat in the dimly lit hotel room, the weight of the phone call still pressing against his chest like a coiled fist. He had been in the sport long enough to know when someone wanted to keep something buried, and this was exactly that. The fight, the stoppage, the media frenzy, it had all played out too cleanly, too perfectly, as if someone had planned every piece of it. He scrolled through the never-ending cycle of news coverage, every headline echoing the same debate, the same controversy, as if the sport itself was desperate to keep its eyes locked on the distraction instead of the truth. He had been in fights before, inside the ring and out, but this wasn't about gloves and rounds anymore. This was about control, and he wasn't the kind of man to let someone else write his story. That night, he made a decision. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years, a connection from the old days, someone who had spent enough time in the sport's underbelly to know the things that never made it to the surface. When the voice on the other end answered, there was no small talk, no hesitation, only a single, pointed question: who's behind it? A long silence followed, and for a moment, Lopez thought the call had dropped. But then the voice spoke, low and deliberate. You already know the answer, Teo. You just don't want to say it out loud. And in that moment, everything snapped into place. This wasn't just about Stevenson or Padley. This wasn't just about a controversial stoppage. This was bigger. The kind of thing that lurked beneath the sport, shaping outcomes, pulling strings, turning fighters into pawns without them ever realizing it. Someone had made sure that fight ended the way it did. Someone had decided, long before the first punch was thrown, what the narrative would be. And the worst part? It had worked. The world was too busy arguing over the surface to see the hands moving underneath it. Lopez clenched his jaw, his mind racing. If this had been just another bad stoppage, it would have faded by now, replaced by the next fight, the next scandal. But this wasn't fading. It was growing. Someone wanted it that way, wanted the world talking, wanted the controversy to fuel something bigger. But why? What was the end game? He thought about Stevenson, about the way he had barely reacted to the stoppage, as if he had already known what was coming. He thought about Padley, about the way he had been left standing there, stripped of his moment, his fury swallowed by the chaos. And he thought about himself, about the call, about the warning, about the unspoken threat woven into every word. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Lopez found himself outside an unmarked gym on the outskirts of the city, a place where whispers carried more weight than shouts. He pushed open the door, stepping into the dimly lit space, the smell of sweat and old leather filling the air. A man stood in the corner, his back turned, hands wrapped loosely in tape. When he turned, Lopez wasn't surprised to see who it was. Padley. He looked different now, not the battered fighter from that night, but something else, something sharper. I knew you'd come, Padley said, his voice even, his eyes tired but burning with something deeper. You saw it too, didn't you? Lopez nodded, stepping forward. It wasn't just a bad call, he said, his voice low. It was a move. A play. But for what? Padley exhaled, shaking his head. You already know. The words hung heavy between them, unspoken truths filling the space like ghosts. And in that moment, Lopez understood. This wasn't about a single fight. It never had been. This was about the sport itself, about who got to control its future. Stevenson had been positioned for something bigger, but he wasn't the one pulling the strings. He was just another piece on the board, just like Padley had been, just like Lopez had been before he had stepped away from it all. And just like that, the final piece clicked. The stoppage wasn't just about ending the fight, it was about ending a narrative before it could become something else. A fighter like Padley, a fighter with nothing but heart and will, was dangerous to the people who controlled the sport. He wasn't supposed to win, wasn't supposed to last long enough to make people believe in something outside the system. So they had taken the choice away. But the mistake they made was thinking that would be the end of it. Lopez took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it all. There were two choices now. Walk away, let the sport keep playing its game, let the people behind the curtain keep deciding who rose and who fell. Or step into the fire, push back, force the truth into the light. He looked at Padley, saw the same decision reflected in his eyes. We make our own fights, Lopez said, his voice firm. We take back control. Padley nodded. And in that moment, the fight that truly mattered began.